Let me start first by saying how delighted we are to have Joseph Pearce with us for this second session of this kind of extraordinary event at, in an extraordinary time in our history with COVID. So we're all learning the virtual world, and we're delighted that Joseph is gracious and as flexible as his reputation has always suggested. So thank you very much, Joseph, for joining us. Joseph Pearce is internationally acclaimed author. He's a native of England. He's written biographies of Chesterton, Solzhenitsyn, of course, Belloc, and an extended study of the Lord of the Rings. He's hosted a 13-part series about Shakespeare on EWTN, as well as on Catholicism and Catholicism in the Lord of the Rings, also on EWTN. If you're interested in learning more about Joseph Pearce, and those of you who would be interested in getting more books from Joseph Pearce, you can go to his website at jpearce.co, and he'd be delighted to let you explore his website and learn more about his prodigious work. His works have been translated in 9 languages. So I struggle with one, and I'm always amazed by the global reach of a brilliant mind. So Joseph, I wanted to start off with just a couple of questions, and then what we'll do is I'll serve to facilitate our discussion. We're centered on 2 books, your biography of Solzhenitsyn and your autobiography, Race with the Devil. In our last session, you outlined and discussed both books, and in the interim, we've had a chance to at least become a little more familiar with them and come prepared to ask them questions. But I wanted to start off because I think that you and Solzhenitsyn share a similar kind of conversion trajectory. The beginning of your book, you describe, just the pit of despair that you were in Wormwood Prison, and certainly Solzhenitsyn through his experience in the Gulag, but specifically, I guess, as a hinge, that moment when he was with Dr. Kornfeld right after his cancer surgery. What is it about the depth of despair that serves as a kind of a unifying catalyst for conversion and an openness to Christ?
Great question. I think it's summed up by the title, the punning title I gave to the episode in Solzhenitsyn's life about his arrest, his original being arrested by the communist system. Just to remind ourselves from the talk a couple of weeks ago, Solzhenitsyn was arrested for criticizing Joseph Stalin in private correspondence to a friend. So not even publicly, but obviously there's no such thing as private correspondence in a totalitarian system. His letters were opened and censored, and they saw he criticized Stalin, and he received a sentence of 7 years hard labor. Now, the title I gave to that chapter discussing his arrest and the sort of the torturous way he was treated afterwards was Arrested Development. Now, of course, on a literal level, arrested development means your development's arrested. In other words, it's not moving forward. But in actual fact, with the pun, he needed to be arrested in order to have the development. So Solzhenitsyn sort of believed that the experience of suffering, first with the experience of seeing the suffering inflicted largely by the Red Army, by the Soviet Army.
Well, that'd be great. So let's press ahead, because everybody's on the line, and you were talking about Solzhenitsyn on the Russian front in Russia, having been arrested for foolishly sharing some critical comments with a friend by mail after winning 2 medals for bravery, in fighting the Germans. And that was all to try to relate your conversion experience with his conversion experience.
Yeah, so basically the same thing happened to me. Is that I mentioned last time, I think, that I went to prison twice. And during that first prison sentence, I was very much a radical, militant, white supremacist. But the second prison sentence, I basically had a very disillusioned with my previous political positions and had desire to convert. So that the beginning of that second prison sentence, on the second day of that 12-month sentence, I found myself praying for the first time. So in both cases, it was the experience, if you like, of life-shattering suffering, something which completely messed up your life, that led to the change. And I'm reminded of the words of Oscar Wilde, when he says that God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone, for how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. So I think sometimes if we're prideful, we have hearts of stone, then that heart has to be broken. And it's actually an act of love by God to break our hearts when they become stone hard like that through pride. And it's suffering that actually does that. And so I do see parallels between my own conversion and Alexander Solzhenitsyn's in that respect.
Well, to that point too, there's the the scene that you described where after his arrest, he's ordered to carry his his equipment bag or his map bag or whatever, and it was a heavy item, and and because he was an officer, he resisted that. And there was actually a German prisoner among them. And he said, well, why didn't the German prisoner take it? And then among the enlisted prisoners, the Russian enlisted prisoners, who were all political prisoners, they took turns. And as you described it, he felt, ashamed for being prideful, just as you described.
Yeah, and at various times, I think one thing I love about Solzhenitsyn, one of many things I love about him, he's a man with a very finely tuned conscience. And, that when he recognized that he was being effectively evil in his relationship with other people through his own pride and selfishness, it cut him to the quick. And I think that sort of sensitivity to our conscience and our moral obligations to our fellow man is something which singles Solzhenitsyn out as someone very special. And I think that's one of the reasons he did the very special things he did, was that he responded to the call of his conscience in a way that he was prepared to actually make major sacrifices, including ultimately the willingness to sacrifice his life to answer the call of his conscience.
Well, that actually is probably a good time to, if you could. I've discovered, because I'm of a certain age, which is old, that I take for granted that the reputation, the name of Solzhenitsyn is as well known today as it was when I was a younger man. I mean, could you just describe just his impact on the the second half of the 20th century?
Yeah, basically, Solzhenitsyn was one of the absolute heroes and giants of the 20th century. He basically, in 1948, when he was in prison at the beginning of his during his 7 years of hard labor, he was determined to play a role in bringing down the Soviet Union. And one man by himself, the small man against the giant of Soviet power, played a significant role in that. So his novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, became an international bestseller. And then, of course, he wrote The Gulag Archipelago, a 3-volume expose of the Soviet prison system. And that made him an international figure. The KGB, the Soviet secret police, attempted to assassinate him using a toxin, and he became very sick but did not die. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature and refused to go and actually accept the prize because he thought that he wouldn't be allowed back into the Soviet Union, which would separate him from his wife and 3 sons. And eventually the Soviet Union became too hot to handle, and they exiled him, first to Switzerland, and then he settled in Vermont in the United States, where he remained until 1994, when he returned to Russia following the fall of the Soviet Union. And if we had to name the giant figures who are most responsible for bringing down the Soviet Empire, we'd have to say that those names would be St. John Paul II, whose feast day, of course, we celebrate today, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So that I think speaks for itself, that he's up there with those giants.
Absolutely. Well, if folks want to kind of jump in with questions, just let me know by chat, and just so that we're not all kind of jumping in. But as we explore his impact, I mean, one of the remarkable things about him is he was fearless in not only confronting the Soviet system, but also, you know, the West, or what was depicted or described at that time as the West. And it really, at the root of it, wasn't it really just kind of materialism, the notion of materialism in the Marxist sense, or materialism and kind of Western consumerism. I mean, he was pretty strident in standing against both, which certainly frustrated people who thought he was speaking for them.
Yeah, so Solzhenitsyn had enough understanding of philosophy to understand that the Enlightenment.
So, Joseph, you can hear us?
I can.
Now, Clayton has a question for you.
Hey, Joseph, you're in Nashville, aren't you?
No, actually, I was teaching for 3 years at Aquinas College in Nashville. But I only went up there 1 week a month. I've been based in Simpsonville, South Carolina since 2006.
Okay, that's right. I'm sorry. Well, we're glad you're in South Carolina. In the book on Solzhenitsyn, I'm just going to read a couple of things and just want you to comment on it because it's pretty profound to me. It's when he was going to decide about joining the NKVD training college. And he said, for some reason, however, he hesitated and then refused. And then he reflects on, if my life had turned out differently, might I myself not have become just such an executioner? It is a dreadful question if one really answers it honestly. And just want you to comment on that because it's, you know, we don't have a moment like he had in his life. I've not been in any war or any community that's been totally deprived like he was in of some of your civil liberties, but just kind of want you to, if you wouldn't mind, please commenting on and reflect on that based on your knowledge of him.
Yeah, I think there are two things. One thing which is particular to Solzhenitsyn and his own life and circumstances, and one which is universal. So the one that's particular is that we have to understand that if we're living within a certain zeitgeist, within a certain culture, then things which, objectively speaking, are utterly objectionable become normal. And if they're normal, it's very easy for us to do the morally objectionable on the basis that everybody else is doing it. And so I think that living within a Soviet system, it would have been very easy for Solzhenitsyn to fall into the system, to become a careerist in the NKVD, in the Soviet secret police, and do horrible things to other people on the grounds that it's normal and maybe defending the state. So let's give you an example about zeitgeist and particularities. Now, for me, it's absolutely horrific that we can live in a culture that sanctions the killing of children. But it's normal, which means that a large part of the population don't bat an eyelid at infanticide. And it's because it's part of the culture, even though objectively speaking, it's obnoxious. So I think that there's an understanding there that, you know, that we can get sucked into the culture in which we live. Now that's the particularity, but I think that the universality, how it's applicable to all of us, I do think that all of us have the potential to be saints, but we also have the potential to go to hell. By which I mean that there are decisions we make in our lives that if we make the wrong decisions, we find ourselves in a lifestyle or a relationship, which is actually a downward spiral. And if we don't, one way or the other, through grace and grace and will and what have you, extract ourselves from that ultimately self-destructive lifestyle and situation and relationship, then we can actually be in a position where we are doing huge damage to ourselves and to others and to the common good. And I think that's something which is possible for all of us. It may well be that when we get older, we've progressed on the spiritual path, it might be considered very unlikely at that point. But I think if all of us, if we look back at our lives, we'll see moments where perhaps there were crossroads. There, but for the grace of God, we might have taken that wrong path, and we could be in a very different place now to where we currently find ourselves. So I think that Solzhenitsyn is thanking God on both counts, that he knows his own weakness as a human sinner, and how that weakness could have led to a self-destructive lifestyle if he'd said yes to one or two relationships, such as the relationship with the Soviet state, instead of saying no. But also, he had to become countercultural. That he had to see that what was considered normal and even patriotic in his own culture was actually destructive and something which he had to resist.
Well, I'm old like Frank, and not really. But you as you get older, you kind of reflect on your past and all the blessings that you had because somebody saved you from a particular path. But I think the challenge, at least for me personally, is adapting to the culture and not speaking up. And I agree with you 100% on abortion and that it's become a part of our culture that people just accept, and I've been guilty of not speaking up about that one situation or that one moral
So the sobering thing about it is that things that really are absolutely morally abhorrent become normal. So obviously we could talk about abortion in our own time, but anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, the crushing of all dissidents in the Soviet Union. This is what everybody's doing. I mean, it's what the culture does. It's even seen as being virtuous and done in the name of freedom. So we can see that if we don't have an objective compass which points us to true north, it's very easy to get disoriented.
Amen.
Russ, did you have a question?
I do. Joseph, it's great to have you with us here tonight. And I've started on your book with Race with the Devil. And on chapter 3, there was something that caught my eye. You quoted Flannery O'Connor, who wrote of the American South that it was hardly Christ-centered, but that it was certainly Christ-haunted. Could you expand on that and then tell us what brought you to South Carolina?
Yes. So, well, first of all, I think that that what Flannery O'Connor is doing there is saying that there's something inseparable from the culture of the South and being haunted by the figure of Christ, even though it's not a confessional part of the world. We don't have, like, for instance, in medieval Europe, where you'd have the Catholic nation and the Catholic culture, that whatever being Southern was inseparable from Christ in some sense. That's what she means, and that's what I think she brings out in her short stories and in her two novels absolutely brilliantly. She's a superb writer. Now, as for me, I've had a romantic attachment to the South since I was a boy back in England. I think it's a love for defeated causes. What J.R.R. Tolkien calls the long defeat, like the Jacobites in England or Scotland, what have you. But when I came to the States, I just became aware that the South is rooted. It's conservative in the best sense of the word, by which I mean not the political sense of the word especially. It actually has a sense of identity, has a sense of rootedness, a sense of its own history and identity, and what it is, which is largely lacking in other parts of the United States. Obviously, the west of the country is very new, and the Midwest is just such a jumble of different influences, depending on which part of the Midwest you're in. And it's really hard to put my finger on, but I love the South. We've been here now since 2006. I can't really see myself living anywhere else. And, I'm a great believer in the Shire. Obviously, I'm a lover of the Lord of the Rings. And for me, the South Carolina, not even the South, which is too big. South Carolina specifically is my Shire, as Sussex was the Shire for Hilaire Belloc. It's the place I'm rooted, and within South Carolina, the 2.5 acres on which we live is literally home in the deepest sense of the word, except, of course, for heaven.
That's wonderful. And I wondered whether you have portrayed rebellious youth, and if there was any attraction to the rebels in the South or South Carolina.
Well, certainly during my white supremacist days, yes, I'd have to confess that was the case. But what happened is when by the grace of God, I was healed, and it took time, because you can. I embraced Catholicism ultimately because of the marriage between faith and reason, between fides et ratio. So I came to acknowledgement of the existence of God, and then the existence of God as revealed by God Himself in Jesus Christ and the establishment of the church, etc., through reading Thomas Aquinas and other doctrinal books. But racism is not something which is rational, which means that it was more difficult to sort of eradicate. And what it really took was prayer and healing. And it wasn't until looking back over the path I'd taken, several years later, that I realized that what was happening here was not a rational process, but a healing process. So, but as regards the South, I still find myself, to me, that the tragedy of the South, I wrote something once, The Imaginative Conservative, called The Tragic South. And I think the tragedy is that the South was wrong on one issue, which was slavery. And I know it's an oversimplification to say that the war between the states was one fought on the issue of slavery. It certainly wasn't the only issue, and arguably not even the major one. But the other issue was subsidiarity, was states' rights, was the right of people to be governed by a local government and not a distant government that got more and more distant. The federal government's got bigger and bigger and bigger and further away from the people. I think that the whole issue of subsidiarity, of the restoration and reinvigoration of strong local and regional government in the United States context, states' rights, has become more important perhaps than ever, including at the time of the war between the states. So that's the reason I have a sympathy for the South. So I think on that side of things, against the burgeoning federal government, they were on the side of the angels. Of course, insofar as that involved the defense of slavery, they were not on the side of the angels. And that's the tragedy. It's the schizophrenia in the whole issue.
Well, Solzhenitsyn in his paper, his work, Rebuilding Russia, kind of drew on, that concept of subsidiarity. And, he was very suspicious of centralized power, obviously, and much more sympathetic to localized democracy. And, as you indicated, I mean, he kind of looked to Switzerland, and that model of local democratic engagement is a healthier model for a community, for a polity.
Yeah, and he exactly, absolutely understood that. And when I met him back in, I think, 1998, I think it was, I asked him, that some of his more recent books, such as Rebuilding Russia and Russia and the Abyss, sort of coincided in his political philosophy with the social teaching of the church and with E.F. Schumacher's famous book, Small is Beautiful. And he said, he acknowledged that, and he said, he wasn't influenced by those things, but it's a case of convergence of ideas. And he understood, that first of all, there are examples of strong local government in medieval Russia, and he certainly drew upon that. He was very influenced by the canton system in Switzerland, as you say. He was also very impressed by the local government, local democracy in the United States. And of course, that's being eroded, and is being progressively eroded as time goes on. But the point is, the states do still have power. They need more. The states need more power, and Washington, D.C. needs less. That's what we need now, is a devolution of power away from the federal government towards the states and towards local government. Because democracy ultimately only works on a human scale. When you're talking about millions, or tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of voters for a single central government, which is completely on a different planet than people voting for it, you don't really have representative government anymore. And I think that's the situation we're finding ourselves in now, increasingly in the United States, with the federal government really being so distant from the grassroots of what's actually happening in the various localities around the United States. That's no longer representative government.
Well, as you describe his thinking, he referred often to, not only the need to form and heal a soul, it's certainly reflected in Clayton's question, but also the soul of a nation. And, clearly he had kind of this sense of a fatherland or a motherland in Russia. And one can't help but wonder whether or not there's a tension between that and, the tribal instinct of human beings, and how easily, we turn on each other in the name of fatherland or motherland.
Yeah, which is, I think, why that. I mean, he talked about national repentance. In other words, that the first thing that Russia had to do was to acknowledge its sins as regards the communist era. And that's the problem in Russia now, because ironically, the communists are somewhat a conservative force, because what they're looking back to is the days when Russia was powerful and had an empire and was the most powerful country in the world, with the possible exception of the United States. And that sort of jingoistic, ultimately imperialistic nationalism is, of course, very destructive. And that's why nationalism itself has to be an acknowledgement of subsidiarity, that if I love my nation, I have to respect other people's love for their nation. And imperialism is a form of internationalism, where when one nation imposes its will on another nation against the other nation's will, that is an act of aggression and imperialism, which is not nationalism, but internationalism, because you're imposing an international order on a nation that doesn't want it. And so that, particularly with larger nations like the United States and Russia, learning to respect the rights of smaller nations on their borders, and certainly this is more true of Russia and the United States, but, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine, that is something which Russia needs to learn, is that all nations are beautiful. Something that Solzhenitsyn said, the nations are like different flowers in the garden of God. And what we don't want is a monoculture, so one giant globalist, monochromatic wheat field across the whole globe, where everyone's buying the same products, wearing the same clothes, watching the same TV programs, listening to the same music. What we want is a genuine multicultural world, where, and the only way of ensuring that is a multiplicity of unique and sovereign nations.
Well, that does get to this notion then of self-limitation that he talked about and expressed in different ways. Not only as it applies to individuals, but then certainly nations. This just self-governing mechanism that just restrains your impulses or your consumer nature or your dialectical determinism or determination.
Yeah, I mean, self-limitation is a key component of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's critical philosophy, but really it is just a euphemism for humility, right? That basically, every act of love is an act of self-limitation. In other words, it's laying down my life for the other, laying down my life for the beloved, even if the beloved is my enemy. Whereas pride is trying to maximize my own power over others. And of course, the irony and the paradox is that the more we actually do that, in the end, the more powerless we become, because we become addicted to sin, we become a slave to sin, we have no friends because we don't love anybody, and therefore nobody loves us. So in other words, the endeavor to not self-limit, but to maximize our own power actually leads to impotence. Whereas the paradox is that love, self-limitation, giving ourselves to others actually liberates us, because then we receive love in return, we have fulfilling lives. So really self-limitation, when he talks about, is humility. And people have to have humility, but so do nations. And if a nation is governed by pride and prejudice always go together, Jane Austen is a philosopher, then the nation is poisonous at that point. And it's for that reason that nationalism has a bad name, because often it has succumbed to pride and prejudice rather than self-limitation.
Well, there's another component
Right.
too. Oh, yeah, by all means, David, jump in.
Sure. So I was going to go back to, the last time you spoke to us, Joseph, I really enjoyed your story and your personal story, like the conversion. We're talking about the nationalism and the bigger picture, and obviously Nazi Germany and Russia and the experiences of Solzhenitsyn. But for you, it was this idea that racism was so prevalent in your life, and you had to get over that. My wife is sitting here with me, and she just was curious if in your search for meaning and your understanding of suffering and how to deal with suffering, if you studied any of those Jewish writers, Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl and those folks.
No, the answer is no. And I think the reason is because when I was young and angry and a white supremacist, I was also anti-Semitic, and I wouldn't have read any of those writers at that time. And then once I actually got into Catholicism, I basically began just reading Catholics, and that's what happened there. So I've just joined the meeting here, by the way.
Excellent. Welcome.
Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Do I hang up?
Yes, I'll hang up. Yes. There we go. You're back.
I was obviously trying to look at things, and I'm not going to bore you with what I did that might have been different. But anyway, all's well that ends well. The only book I think by a Jewish writer that I can offhand remember reading, and it's a wonderful book, and it is Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette. And I don't know if you know the story behind that, but of course Franz Werfel was a German-speaking Jew, and trying to escape from Nazi Germany, finds himself in France, and of course the Germans are then invading France, and he's trying to escape across the border, across the Pyrenees into Spain, and he finds himself in Lourdes, and which is obviously not far from in the French Pyrenees. And here's the story of Our Lady of Lourdes, and actually prays to the Blessed Virgin, and this is of course as a Jew, but praying to the Blessed Virgin that if she assists him in escaping from the Nazis, he will tell her story. And of course, he succeeds in escaping from the clutches of the Nazis and fulfills that promise and writes this wonderful novel based upon the true story of the apparition of Lourdes, the apparitions at Lourdes, which I actually think is one of the finest novels of the 20th century. I'm so pleased to have read that. And Franz Werfel never converted, which does surprise me, because you have that intimate relationship with the Blessed Virgin, and then this creative outpouring of the muse or grace to tell that wonderful story. But that's certainly that's one of the most powerful things I've ever read. But offhand, that's the only book by a Jewish writer that I can think of having read.
Well, just kind of returning for a moment to Solzhenitsyn, because there was, certainly his notion of humility, but the binding nature of his philosophy, I think that you summed up in quoting from a passage from Cancer Board. Was it weariness or illness that gave him this urge to yawn, or was it because these arguments, counter arguments, technical terms, bitter, angry glances suddenly seemed so much squelching in a swamp? None of this was to be compared with the disease that afflicted them or with death which loomed before them. He yearned for the touch of something different, something pure and unshakable. But where he would find that, Oleg had no idea. You go on to say this passage from the cancer ward encapsulates much of Solzhenitsyn's central message in the modern world, the ultimate subsistence of politics within a higher moral and ultimately religious truth, the transcendent nature of pain and death and immensity of both in relation to the transient circumstantial comforts. And most important of all, the inarticulate yearning of agnostic man for the sublime depths of theological truth, a return to religious faith. So, you know, I mean, it would seem to me that fortified him to speak truth to the West, who thought he was a hero until he criticized them, and to the Politburo, who never much cared for him at all.
No, because they actually share deep down, they have common roots in the Enlightenment, as Solzhenitsyn said, that Marxism is a fruit of the Enlightenment, and modern materialistic hedonism, which is as manifest in the West, is also a child of that same Enlightenment. And what Solzhenitsyn understood is that politics and economics are not standalone sciences, but are derivatives from philosophy and theology. That if you change the philosophy and theology, you change the economics and the politics. So once you believe, for instance, in God, and particularly the Christian God, the dignity of the human person is sacrosanct, and that completely changes the way you view politics and economics. You can't tread on people to get your political rights. You can't tread on people to make an economic profit. The dignity of the human person transcends and trumps those lesser things in the hierarchy of goods. So, you know, Solzhenitsyn understood, as did Schumacher, that basically politics and economics are a branch of philosophy, and ultimately philosophy is fulfilled by the queen of the sciences, which is theology. Obviously, ultimately philosophy, the key question that philosophy has to answer is there a God, right? And if the answer to that question is yes, does God reveal himself? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it becomes a theological question and not a philosophical question. And theology then becomes at the center of our understanding of not just of philosophy, but of politics and economics and all those other derivatives.
Isn't that part of what kind of cracked, you know, your shell a little bit in your conversion trajectory when you read the Gulag, and kind of that opened your eyes a little bit to what he was saying throughout that novel?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize at the time that I was being drip-fed Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, when I was reading the Gulag, but that's what was happening. And so I read Solzhenitsyn because I was an anti-communist in a sort of a knee-jerk neo-Nazi way, like the way that Hitler was anti-communist. So I read it because, you know, Solzhenitsyn is an anti-communist, but I was being taken further up and further in, as C.S. Lewis would say. I was being taken deeper into not just the shallow surface of politics, but into the depths of philosophy, and then deeper into that theological underpinning of philosophy. Now, that was all something which was subliminal at the time, but, you know, I've discovered that subliminal things take root, you know, and so I fell in love with Chesterton without liking his Catholicism, fell in love with Belloc without liking his Catholicism. I fell in love with Solzhenitsyn without liking his orthodoxy. But in the end, you come to realize what you like about them is because of their Christianity. That's why they are who they are, is because of the Christianity which informs who they are. And so the point is, you're getting sucked in. It's almost like being, you know, reeled in, you know, by someone who's fishing. You're actually, you've taken the bait without realizing it, and the bait is Jesus Christ, and thanks be to God. Please,
you know, let me know if you have some questions here from the floor. I don't mean to spend all my all the evening kind of talking.
Chat box on now. Things seem to be actually working. I'm going to turn the chat box on, so that also doesn't seem to be anything in it at the moment, though.
Lisa,
Well,
do you have a question?
Well, I do. You know, given this is really wonderful and fascinating, and you know, it's so easy to be aligned with this idea that your faith leads you down a path, or you're led down a path, and then it dramatically changes you. And so it begs the question, like, how do you take steps every day to make that a part of your discipleship? And of course, as a scholar, your discipleship is probably based on being a scholar, Joseph, but as an employee in a corporation, how do you be mindful of that discipleship? Or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, and up to a point, I feel somewhat inadequate in answering the question for someone who's in the corporate world, because I'm very blessed that for many years now, basically when my first book was published in 1996, my biography of Chesterton, I had to make a decision whether just to take the money and be wealthy for a year, maybe have a good holiday somewhere, or whether to actually give up the day job and become a full-time writer and try to write another book before the money ran out. And I took the latter choice. And since then, and that's now 24 years, I've been a full-time writer, and also with other things now, editing, but it's all within the Catholic world. So, I'm very blessed, and Domine non sum dignus, I'm not worthy, that to wake up in the morning looking forward to my day's work, because it's in the vineyard. I'm not worthy for that, but every day I rejoice. I enjoy weekends. I don't get involved with that because also I'm paterfamilias. I'm father of a family, husband, father, and so in the evenings and the weekends it's sacrosanct for the family. But I love my working life. But if someone has a secular job that perhaps they don't particularly find very fulfilling in the corporate world, then really I'm not the best person to answer the question, because those people I think are in a much more difficult situation than I am. Maybe God knows I'm weak and he pushed me somewhere relatively safe. I don't know. But certainly, what I find completely essential is prayer and a routine of prayer. So, I try not to start the day ever without saying my morning prayers, and try not to rush them. So actually putting time aside, so that's what you're doing. You're not trying to sort of fit it in while you're driving the car or what have you. You found the space for it. And then evening prayers, and then trying to return to prayer throughout the day, because we do need to remember as Christians that we cannot do any of this through the triumph of our own will. That's the heresy of Pelagianism. That we can only do things by cooperating with the grace of God, that supernatural assistance which all of us need. So the most important thing is to have a prayer life and have a relationship with Jesus, and it's through that we manage to take on whatever challenges we have during the day. But I do feel that I feel like I'm sort of I'm the person back in base when all the frontline soldiers are out there, in that secular workspace. So I'm not worthy to answer on any deeper level than that I've just attempted.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I think that it brings to mind the idea of what you have going here, Frank, is that we collectively wrestle with this. As professionals in the Carolina Catholic professionals, we have I think that we should really take advantage of that ability to do faith sharing, and maybe even do case analysis on some of our luncheons, where we sit there and say, hey, this is what happened, and here I am in my office, and I was faced with this, and this is how it turned out. I wonder if maybe we should try that, to be able to coach each other on, or just help each other think through it. Sometimes when I know that I'm going to be interacting in a way that is challenging, or I feel like there might be an opportunity where I'm going to get to be, to share my faith. It's almost like I want to practice beforehand. I process out loud. And so I almost want to call somebody and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Let me hear how this sounds and whether you think it's going to go over. But because I think you get called to be a disciple if you keep if you're paying attention, and when I do pay attention, I realize how many times a day I miss representing my faith to people. And so anyways, this is a good form and I appreciate it, and think whatever we can do to do more with it, that would be great.
Lisa, that's an excellent thought, and excellent thoughts and suggestions. Certainly something that we should do in the future. Absolutely. I'd love to explore that with you further. And, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it brings to mind, again, kind of returning to Solzhenitsyn, the one kind of universal construct that linked his testimony of truth against both the old Soviet system and Marxism and the materialism of Marxism and consumer materialism was the absence of God. And your, Joseph, in your autobiography, and you mentioned Richard Dawkins, and Dawkins is, like the Marxists, was trying to scrub the earth of the churches. And what did that leave you with? A rationale for your own, kind of racial sentiments.
Yeah, exactly. The point is, we either have the real presence or we have the real absence. And that's the real defining aspect of society. If we have the real absence of God, that vacuum is filled with viciousness. But you won't have virtue, you will have viciousness. There's no middle path. So when you suck God out of the cosmos, you create a vacuum which is filled with human viciousness. And that's why you have these, the track record of atheistic, secularistic ideology is not pretty. I sometimes characterize it with the 3 Gs, the guillotine, the gulag, and the gas chamber. Now, these secular fundamentalist regimes have killed tens of millions of people, because they do not have any concept of the dignity of the human person, and they ride roughshod over human rights. They tread on fellow human beings with a jackboot. They put them to death, and this is the danger when we do not and refuse to learn the lessons of history, is that we do repeat them, which is why you've got 20-year-olds who have no knowledge of history whatsoever that somehow think that communism is an idealistic ideology which bring about justice. Any knowledge of the track record of people that have tried to do that in the past should be enough to make everybody not touch it with a barge pole. But it's the ignorance of history that leads to the arrogance of ideology.
Well, and it's that notion of God too that connects you through history. To Lisa's point too, corporate America now is working overtime trying to expunge any reference to God from just the function of day-to-day living, and not only just erase it, but then also demand an acceptance of things that are not necessarily consistent with Catholic or Christian teaching, or just matters of conscience. And it is an increasing struggle, I think.
And the consequences, of course, this is myopic, and this is going to be a deep conversation for this stage of the evening. But that if we believe in nothing but market forces, now the market is myopic. Now the market doesn't care about what's happening 5 years from now or 10 years from now, or what happened 5 years ago. It's what's happening now. So the corporate America has no interest in not just history, but in 50 years from now, because that their stakeholders, stockholders, shareholders want the dividend at the end of this particular fiscal year. They don't want to be told, well, we're strategizing 15 years from now. So there's a built-in myopia, and in consequence, of course, that they are literally doing nothing but responding in a very shallow reactionary way to whatever the zeitgeist tells them, right? If this is what they think is necessary now to maximize profits today, if these ideas are in, whatever they happen to be, BLM, for instance, at the moment, right, LGBT, right? It's interesting, by the way, that the ugly thing is you can only talk about in terms of acronyms, but that whatever's fashionable becomes what's followed. And the danger with that, of course, is literally it's like walking in the dark and just waiting to bump into something.
Well, it's interesting you say that too, because, you know, part and parcel with that is, you know, the facilitation of people trying to depict someone as the other, to isolate them, to mock them, to belittle them, you know, and that was, you know, as you wrote, I mean, Solzhenitsyn found that when, you know, in his early travels in the West, there was a quote from a Guardian writer that you referenced, where because he didn't agree with Solzhenitsyn, his response was just to call him a fascist,
Right.
which, you know, kind of.
And the same thing now, the slogan of the BLM, no justice, no peace. The point is, no love, no justice, right? So if you're not going to bring love into the equation, which is, as a Christian understanding, love's not a feeling, an emotion, which is just, you know, that's just an irrational thing. But love is to freely choose rationally to give yourself to another person. If that is absent from all of our social, political, economic life, we will not have justice, right? So you can't start with no justice, no peace. You have to start with love, because with love, that is the prerequisite for justice. And if justice is the prerequisite for peace, you have to start with love. And in the present climate, it's all about hating everybody else. Everybody's hating everybody else, and nobody wants to sit down and talk, let alone sit down and hug. Not that we're allowed to now because of social distancing.
Well, at a time with, you know, a renewed generational interest in Marxism, despite its abhorrent track record, and even, you know, current day examples, and, you know, despite, you know, his warning about just a consumerist culture, just, again, crushing souls, you know, in a kind of a godless way, we find ourselves, as you're saying, you know, in a hyper state of that through social media, through various forms of internet communication and the like. So, I mean, you know, was Solzhenitsyn a prophet for our time?
Yes, he's an absolute giant of the 20th century. His witness stands historically, but everything he taught about the 20th century is absolutely as applicable to the 21st century. And if we don't learn those lessons, we're going to make the same mistakes, and that could lead to the deaths of tens of millions of people. This is a high stakes poker game we're talking about here, and if we don't get people to understand what's at stake, we are going to end up with tens of millions of people dead. And that's not an exaggeration, because it's happened in the past. It happened in the 20th century. The most bloody, the whole concept of progress, the most bloody, barbaric, murderous century in terms of the numbers killed in the whole of human history was the last century. And we're only 20 years into this one. And if we're not careful, this will actually be worse than the previous century, which would be absolutely diabolical should that come to pass. And let's talk about things here about, you know, no justice, no peace. Global corporate America and the Democratic Party and the Marxists have no problem with China. China is an absolutely unjust society in terms of human rights. It does all sorts of things which make whatever's wrong with the United States seem trivial. And yet China's okay, right? Because China's an important component in the global mechanism. So it doesn't matter if you tread on people's heads as long as globalism is intact. So we see hypocrisy here. We're not going to see the Democratic Party, should they come to power, doing anything about the injustices in China, or about the way that big social media is basically putting the plugs on the whole democratic process. None of that's going to be touched. So really, what we're going to see is, on the assumption that the election goes in that direction, we're going to see basically the erosion and maybe even destruction of fundamentals of our democratic society in terms of the rights of individuals to have a say on the direction the country is going. These are very interesting times. The only thing I would say, I wrote something today for the Imaginative Conservative called "Give the Devil Enough Rope," and the first sentence is, "Give the devil enough rope and he will hang himself give him enough power and he'd hang us first. Now, the important thing about that, and it's completely bound up in both the Soviet Union and Solzhenitsyn, but also my own white supremacism and the Nazis, is that you don't have to defeat evil, because evil is always in the process of defeating itself. What you have to do is resist it, because if it gets enough power, innocent victims go to the wall. So we saw it in the 1960s, Roe v. Wade, and the victims of infanticide. We've obviously seen it with the Gulag and the gas chamber, the guillotine, etc. So they even has to be resisted because innocent victims are at stake. But even if the devil gets enough rope to hang us first, the devil does hang himself. The French Revolution destroyed itself. It wasn't destroyed, it destroyed itself. The Third Reich, yeah, it was destroyed in a war, but it was because of Hitler's megalomania and trying to outdo Napoleon and taking on the Soviet Union, two fronts at once. Communism ultimately imploded, Soviet communism, within its own internal corruption. So, the Spanish Civil War, the reason that the nationalists won is because the anarchists and the communists spent more time killing each other. The evil is self-destructive. We don't have to worry about defeating evil. We have to worry about being or becoming saints, and then that be a beacon in the world to show people the alternative to the darkness.
Well, that brings us back, I think, to, again, I thought Lisa's question was great, and that is just from your experience as a man who had to have the courage to face, former peers who looked at you as a traitor, from your understanding of how Solzhenitsyn had to stand up, within a system that was seeking to crush him. How does a person, and again, it's not as dire a situation, but still it is difficult when you have peers and people around you have views and, strong feelings and are willing to accuse you of things just because it advances their position. How do you find that courage to stand up like that?
Well, you find courage through grace, through supernatural assistance. But one thing I would say is I'm currently writing a history of Catholic England. And today I actually transitioned from the Elizabethan regime to the Jacobean regime, so from Elizabeth I to James I. And one of the glories of understanding history is to see that nothing changes. So, in Elizabethan England, if we talk about, that Christians are under the cosh, in modern America, modern secularized America, in Elizabethan England, it was punishable by death to be a priest. It was punishable by death to harbor a priest. The Catholic Church was illegal. And the heroism that was the consequence of that is one of the most noble episodes in human history. And for me, as an Englishman, as a Catholic, I gained a great deal of sustenance spiritually and buttressing and reinforcement spiritually from knowing what Catholics before me have done when the world has sought to crucify them. And we do need to realize that the whole template was put in place with the crucifixion of our Lord. And we're told that if they persecute me, they will persecute you. There's nothing new under the sun. We should not even want to be too comfortable in the world, which is a vale of tears and the land of exile. We should keep our eyes on heaven. And as we get older, by the way, it gets easier because, I can already see the finishing line on the horizon and I'm keeping my eye on it, right? And when you're much younger, then you've got all sorts of other things that are distracting you. But the end of the world, this is the most important thing. The end of the world happens when we die, right? And that's the only end of the world we have to worry about, because when we die, we face our maker. And either we are with him forever, which means that we've achieved the whole purpose and only meaning of life, which is to get to him, or we don't, which means we are literally miserable losers. So that's the only thing that matters. The end of the world for each of us is coming soon. The end is nigh. It doesn't matter whether the world continues for another 10,000, 10 million years. It's irrelevant to us because we're going to leave time and enter eternity, which is bigger than time. And so we need to keep our eye on the end of the world, which is for us is the end of our lives.
Are there other questions out there?
This is Russ. I have other questions about Race with the Devil, but I hate to leave Solzhenitsyn. Joseph, in your book, you talked about so many different factions when you were growing up in and around London. Do they still exist, or had they been replaced by other factions?
That's a good question. One thing one understands when you move to another country, and of course there's an irony. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I was very anti-immigrant. And here I am speaking to you as an immigrant. God has a great sense of humor. But once you actually, become an immigrant and you leave your own country, every time you return home, it's not the same place it was when you left it. So, England to me is something of an alien field now. I mean, in London, for instance, where I was raised, all of the old traditional Dickensian streets in central London, I used to do all the shortcuts and every shortcut in that Dickensian London. None of it's there anymore because the big global corporations have built, skyscrapers, and those streets don't exist. So the place is not even the same in any meaningful sense. Now, the countryside of England is as beautiful. The villages are as beautiful. The small market towns are as beautiful. The cities were ugly even when I was a child. So the neo-Nazi racist thing I was involved in was a consequence of the first waves of immigration. So in my part of London, we had a large number of Muslim and Sikh immigrants, and there was a reaction to that. Now, London now, central London now, the immigrants are the majority, which is probably why London was the only part of England that voted to remain in the European Union. So England is sort of very different from England I grew up in. And I do think the British Nationality Act, which was passed in 1948, which opened the gates to immigration on an imprudent scale, has changed the face of England in not necessarily always good ways. And I think it was a bad act and should not have been passed, at least not in the terms in which it was passed. So I think that my reaction against that as a young man was sort of understandable. But if it turns, through propaganda by extremist organizations, playing on a young man's idealism so that his love for country has turned into hatred of his fellow man, at that point, it's become poisonous and self-destructive. And so there was a period of time, for 10 years in my life when I was animated by the animus of racial hatred, and that's destructive. And is racism still around in England? Of course. I think it takes all sorts of forms now. I think that for instance, the Muslim community has become very radicalized, and feels itself at war with the host community, and so it's become, when I was growing up, the Pakistanis were a small minority, relatively speaking, and were timid because they were outnumbered. Now they have muscles and they're flexing them, and so I can see that there's a possibility of a balkanization and civil war, which I hope doesn't come to pass. But again, without the transcendental presence of Jesus Christ, and England is a secular country, with radical Islam and just secular materialism, it's not going to be a pretty sight. We're seeing it in France as well, in Germany. So, I think that we're creating a mess for ourselves, and Jesus is the answer.
Thank you for that. And lastly, can you help me you mentioned the difference between England and Great Britain. Can you help me understand the difference?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'll do, if you don't mind. It's a very short poem I wrote, because I'm a convert, not merely from sort of agnostic racism to Catholic Christianity, but I'm also a convert from being a great Britisher to being a little Englander. So that this is absolutely crucial to my understanding of the two. So this is a poem I wrote. It's very short. When Britain had an empire, the sun would never set, but the sun set over England, and Englishmen forget that greater than the empire are the rolling Yorkshire moors, and more glorious the dales than all the empire's wars. So sort of explain that is that, I used to be British and we controlled 1/3 of the land area of the world. The parts of the global map that were pink were ours, the Union Jack, the unity of the nations of within the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, England and Ireland. And now I just want England because I want my country to be small and beautiful. I love England because of the Yorkshire moors and the Yorkshire dales and the beauty of the landscape and the beauty of the small medieval English market towns and villages, the castles, the ruined abbeys. That's the country that I love, and I'm not interested in a country that wants to march around the world pressing its jackboot upon other nations.
Subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity, exactly. And small is beautiful. Just to love your nation because it's small and beautiful, not because it's big and strong.
Indeed. Any other questions here? We're about ready to wrap up.
Which is why, by the way, just to be controversial, get rid of controversy.
Well,
for me, we should reverse things. And when we fly flags from civic buildings, in South Carolina, the South Carolina flag should be top and the American flag should be underneath it, because that is the principle of subsidiarity. We are South Carolinians that are also part of the United States.
Yes, sir.
That would be controversial in some places.
Oh yeah, get me shot in some places, I'm sure.
Yeah,
any other questions, David?
Yeah, so I was going to ask just real quick. There's a lot of things happening in the news today, and we've got a pope that is transcending Catholicism and reaching across to other, people in society that we haven't, as Catholics, typically accepted. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, the most important thing is that Jesus Christ established a church, established the church, and the church is supposed to teach and preach and practice the truth. And relativism is not the truth. I'm not interested in accusing Pope Francis of that. I was at Clear Creek Abbey at the weekend, and there's wonderful Benedictine monks there. Now 54 of them, at least 30 of them, are under 35 years of age. And during lunch and supper, they have a reading, which is very much part of the Benedictine. Everyone eats in silence with someone reading, and they're reading Pope Francis' new encyclical. And of course, there are parts of it which I agree with, but some of it is barely Catholic in the meaningful sense of the word. For instance, he quotes liberty, equality, and fraternity as something which is good. Well, that is the battle slogan of the French Revolution. In talking about liberty, equality, and fraternity without at least qualifying it in some way, is spitting on the graves of the tens of thousands of people of the Vendée who stood up for the faith against the secular fundamentalism of the French Revolution and were actually victims of a genocide. And so if none of that's addressed, there's a problem. See, the glory of St. John Paul II, whose feast day we celebrate today, and Benedict XVI, is they thought clearly and coherently, and everything they said did not have loose ends going in directions where they sort of just end up not being anywhere. Pope Francis does not have that cogent way of thinking, and he should realize his weakness in that regard and do what he does well, and do not try to sort of teach or preach in a doctrinal way when he doesn't actually have a way of articulating the authentic magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, in a way which is coherent and cohesive, because all he's doing is sowing confusion. And again, he's betrayed the Catholics in China to the Chinese Communist Party. Again, you could catalog the crimes against humanity of the Communist Party in China, and this Pope Francis, God bless him, has chosen to sell out the Catholics who have been persecuted by communism for 50 years to allow the Communist Party to have a say in who can be bishops in China. I'm sorry, there are all sorts of weird things going on. But let me say one thing. This is where history liberates us. You look at the history of the church, there have been numerous bad popes. Now, Dante was not wrong to put popes in hell. I'm sure there are popes in hell. At the moment, we just had a golden age of popes, almost 200 years of glorious popes, which is very unusual, actually. So, I'm not fazed by the fact that, that sometimes the Pope might do or say something which makes me feel uncomfortable, because it's not the first time, and it presumably will not be the last that that's the case. So, and one good thing about it is St. John Paul II, he was so charismatic that when he died and passed the mantle to Benedict XVI, that the Pope had become a pop star. That the Pope is a saint because he's the Pope. Well, that's never been the case.
The end of this in here, so you can turn it up.
Sorry.
What was that? Sorry.
No, forgive me. Somebody popped in. No worries.
Okay. So the point is that we had this sort of idea that just because someone becomes Pope, they immediately have a halo, because St. John Paul II was a saint and very charismatic, started World Youth Day, all these glorious things he did. And that's not because he was John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła. It was because he was the Pope. Well, no. Every Pope is different. They all have their own charisms, some better than others. And I'm hoping, I think in the longer, bigger scheme of things, this will bring us down to earth here, that the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth. He has what comes with the papacy, but as an individual, he is a man. And unless he teaches ex cathedra from the chair, which does not happen very often, everything he says is not necessarily true, and we're not bound to every word that's uttered by someone in the chair of Peter. So, so as long as you're not teaching ex cathedra, it's not a problem. So I'm not worried. Generally speaking, I've just disengaged from Pope Francis. I don't want to say anything negative about him, because I'm not interested in criticizing the Pope. You've asked a question, so you've put me on the spot. So, you won't see much in writing, or virtually nothing in writing for me about Pope Francis, because if he does something I approve of, I don't want to write about it, because people will take that to mean that I approve of other things he said, which I don't. But nor am I interested in saying anything negative about the Vicar of Rome, because I'm a Catholic and try to be a loyal one. So that's basically where I'm at on that. And thanks for the awkward question.
Isn't that something of a blessing, though, in that sense that it gives, really puts the onus clearly on, the laity to step up and find their voice, not in opposition, but in affirmation of the message of Christ, the gospel, and the truth of the church. Does it, rather than being distracted by these things, there's so many distractions in this world, doesn't it put us on the spot to speak up and say, this is what we believe and why, and let's look to Christ?
The challenge is to be orthodox and charitable at the same time. So what we must not allow to happen to us in our relationship with political opponents in the secular world, or people that we think are getting things wrong within the church, is to become angry and lose charity. If we cannot respond to error in a secular world or within the church with the spirit of love, we should not respond at all.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end. So, and we are at that time. So, Joseph, I can't thank you enough for your time and for your brilliance and your words. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Well, it's been a joy, and I really am grateful to all of you for the invitation and for being with me this evening and 2 or 3 weeks ago, whenever it was. I apologize to the degree that I may have been culpable for the technical issues we've had tonight. And I do hope that post-pestilence, that I might be able to get to see all of you in the flesh in Charleston. And you are, after all, only 3.5 hours away. So, it's always good to be able to go meet fellow Catholics without having to jump on a plane. So so I hope that maybe when days are a bit smoother, maybe we can get together in the flesh, which was of course the original idea for this gathering.
Indeed. We'd love to see you. You're welcome for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for your time. And we will post this on a website tomorrow. Thank you so much. God bless you all.